what leads me to crypto to blockchain is this firm conviction that centralized systems are complex, unnecessarily complex and corrupt. And for the common man to have a chance, to have the opportunity, we have to look to decentralized systems, i.e. blockchain and beyond. And that is my firm conviction, Nick.
Very interesting. So basically, from your background, John, you've seen how traditional centralized systems can grow to a point where they almost have that feeling similar to the banking system that they're too big to fail, that there's no way that they can be challenged, or anytime there's a problem, something's always going to give. They're always going to be able to continue forward and growing their power monopoly. You, on the other hand, have talked a lot about decentralization. So I'm curious to hear a little bit, John, like, crypto, since we chatted back during the bear market, I mean, as a market has scaled out much larger. But I'm really curious to hear where you think that 5-10 year vision is going to be for the whole crypto space as a whole and blockchain. And how do you think it's going to impact our lives at the end of the day?
Oh, certainly, certainly. I want to just maybe provide a bit of a context. I do believe, it is my belief that the financial system, we're going to hit a significant crisis, a breaking point, if you will, in the very short term. And so the implications, firstly, with respect to, I guess you could say, crypto, is that consumers, the common man, is going to look for ways to preserve their assets and their savings. And I believe there is going to be a significant uptick. The pendulum is swinging and will swing significantly. On the other side, with respect to blockchain, and I see a distinction of, Bitcoin versus blockchain. What I mean by blockchain is platforms. We have platforms, Ethereum, N3, and more, which are really platforms in the true sense of the word. What this means, however, is that in the history of computing, in the history of computer science, software technology, platforms, we have never seen an economic platform, Nick. We have seen platforms galore, PCs, mainframes, the cloud, SOA, services, but blockchains are economic platforms, which means that intrinsically you have baked in crypto economic protocols. And this is the big shift we are seeing with respect to IT and enterprises as they finally wake up and understand the implications of exploiting and building on economic platforms. And for this, we need tools. We need developer tools. We need developers, the millions of developers across the world, to be able to comprehend and again to exploit, to create value and extract value out of this. And this is a personal passion of mine with respect to developers, because I believe unless and until the blockchain space looks beyond our little corner and we welcome every single developer across the world, that's when we're going to see this tipping point from a developer and a platform adoption. Now, like I said, there is the consumer side, which I believe, as people eventually look through the fact that the emperor has no clothes in the existing financial system, that is going to be the tipping point, in my opinion.
So I want to go back on one thing you talked about, John, which is, for me, I think one of the strongest points you've always emphasized when we've chatted is this idea of having an economic layer on top of protocols. And again, I think a lot of people kind of still don't really get why this is going to be very impactful in the world. But what you brought up earlier that I think is so incredible to think about is that what we've seen so far built on top of protocols like Ethereum in the crypto space has already been pretty incredible. We've built decentralized exchanges. We've built decentralized protocols where you can earn interest. And as you pointed out, with the kind of innovation we have seen, this is with a relatively small pool of engineers when we're talking about the global numbers, because of the restrictions of the languages people have to use. They have to use these like really niche implementations of JavaScript like Solidity, right? And you have to build within that language framework. You can't use all the languages you're already previously familiar with. I know at N3, for example, for Neo, that you guys have taken a different approach and stuff, which is basically focusing on bringing in the traditional language framework for people to be able to build applications in languages they're familiar with. And I think that when you can open up the floodgates to more engineers like that, give them the tools they need, and on top of that, you let them use the languages they're used to, the innovation we're going to see, it's going to be our S-curve moment for crypto and blockchain as a whole.
Absolutely. No, I think you're spot on. Just to provide a little bit more context on what I mean by this economic platform, Nick, is You look at, for example, Bitcoin or any of the existing, DeFi protocols, right? They are not applications in the classic sense of the world. They are not apps. They are institutions in the sense they are self-governing, self-directing, and self-propagating. Now, we could never have built an institution on any of the previous waves of platforms. And this is why I draw the very clear distinction that these are economic platforms, right? Every single one of the existing protocols out there. And your second point, you're absolutely right. Developers, right? There's 20, approximately 25 million professional developers out there, and they use a variety of languages. So the key is, again, like you said, a polyglot perspective, like what, with N3 we have done with the toolkit, is to say, look, it doesn't matter. You like C# or JavaScript, you like a Python, it doesn't really matter. But what you want and what we will give you is the best in class industry experience, Nick. And we have built the best developer tools in the entire industry. We have built this because I know this because I built the tools for Microsoft, and I can tell you what we have right now is comparable, if not superior, to what Azure has, to what Amazon Web Services have done.
Very cool. So on that point, John, for people who may not know, one of the things that I forgot to mention as an accolade earlier that builds into this point, you helped build the framework for .NET, which is still used. It's one of the most widespread, if I'm not mistaken, kind of like language frameworks that people utilize when building. So I wanted to ask you, and maybe a little bit more detail and stuff, what does it look like for an engineer and stuff if they want to utilize the toolkits that you guys have built? And again, some of the points as to why it might be such a revolution in getting new engineers into the space.
Yeah, definitely. So what we have done is we've made it as simple and as friction-free as, for example, building and using a Lambda function on Amazon Web Services, or an Azure function on the Microsoft Azure Cloud. The same experience. You go to VS or VS Code, we have the extensions, add, click, push button. In about 3-4 minutes, you can build a smart contract. And that is something that has not been done before, right? But there's more to it, right? What we have done, and in my role also as a governing board member of the Global Blockchain Business Council, Nick, we are working on industry standards, open protocols, open schemas. I believe it is going to be a multi-chain world. That's a fact. It's just a fact. And so in that world, interoperability becomes critical, becomes key. And so I am working actively on standards like, for example, the token taxonomy framework, where we have the ability to create a meta model, a taxonomy, if you will, to create and instantiate tokens. Tokens meaning, digital assets of any form factor. So what we have done in the tool set is to also make it open standards compatible, so that you have the ability to translate the work you're doing, your IP across, obviously multiple instantiations with respect to the underlying platform. And I think this is a critical deal because I have seen the movie before, with the cloud stacks at Microsoft, with web services. I was a founding member of the web services protocol standards. And so I know exactly how this movie plays. And it's absolutely critical that we ensure developers have a base of openness, schemas, protocols, and interoperability.
Very interesting. So on that point, John, maybe just to give people an understanding of this concept of interoperability. So we've got multiple different networks out there, or layer ones, if you will, these different protocols that can do certain types of things. They have differing degrees of scalability, decentralization, and because of that, they might be useful for certain things. But I wanted to ask you on the topic of interoperability, an example maybe we could explain to people to understand this concept of chains communicating with one another. One of them that comes to mind that I think is probably very practical for people who've experimented with these different chains is bridging. But I'm assuming that interoperability doesn't stop and end at bridging. It also has to do with understanding, as you mentioned, common frameworks and standards to make sure that maybe even smart contracts could interact with one another cross-chain.
Absolutely. So, so it's a very good question. I think you're spot on. Just to give a sense of how to think about it, I'll give you two perspectives. One is if you look at the commercial perspective, you may have supply chains, consortia, for example, right? All business is multi-party business. Inherently, you have multiple parties coming together. So these parties might want to preserve some level of what is a private version of a blockchain and what is a public, for example, version of the blockchain. So in this case, you may have multiple players, multiple entities, multiple parties. And like you said, to be able to bridge, to be able to just connect, to share, to collaborate, you need these open standards for the schemas, for the protocols, right? We're not saying that, there's going to be a one size fits all, because we know that never works. However, it is a fact that multiple business parties will need to, at a minimum, connect, collaborate, right, and share. On the other side, if you look at the geopolitical perspective, Nick, I think it's pretty obvious that it's going to be multiple hotspots, right? It's highly unlikely that the powers that be will accept one. So there will be, by definition, multiple. And of course, again, geopolitical collaboration, connecting and communication will happen, will need to happen. So there again, you need open schemas, standards and protocols for perhaps, what might be, let's say, 3 or 4 different global hotspots with respect to blockchain consortia, and then the need to connect these 3 or 4 global hotspots.
If I could just recap it here in this case, John, you see that as time progresses, the traditional, if we're viewing this at a purely tech basis, and I want to try to break it down as best as possible, you have this kind of grand vision over the next decade or so that we're not only going to see the perfect storm, the opportunity where a lot of the centralized giants of today, your Amazons, Microsofts, Googles, that have all this kind of architecture and infrastructure in place that's centralized. We were talking about AWS, Azure, Google Cloud. All these systems, not only maybe enterprise systems, but other types of systems we can't even imagine, are going to start to lose their ground in the grand scheme of things. They're going to lose their position in the world, their authority in the world, and instead we're going to see a rise of various different types of decentralized protocols like Ethereum, like Neo, like Solana, Avalanche, all these different chains that are going to serve various different purposes and going to have standardized frameworks to be able to communicate with one another and be able to maintain that economic layer and all the features and applications built on top of it. Is that where you see things going in the long term?
Absolutely. Brilliant summary, Nick. Absolutely. Very well said. Decentralized and yet interconnected.